Welcome back. This is the fourth and final episode in our quiet series on the life of Vincent van Gogh. If you're just joining us, you're very welcome here. And if you've been listening along from the beginning, thank you for continuing the journey. In the earlier episodes, we traced Vincent's early life and faith, his gradual turning toward art, and the time he spent in Paris, a period of learning, exposure, and light that changed the way he saw the world. Tonight, the story slows again. This episode follows Vincent into a more uncertain chapter, one shaped by choice, vulnerability, and the quiet effort of continuing. It is not a story of sudden resolution or recognition. It is a story of living day by day, of seeking steadiness, and of painting through uncertainty. As always, this series is created to be listened to slowly, whether you're resting, reflecting, or drifting toward sleep. You don't need to hold on to every detail. Simply let the story unfold at its own pace. If you find these quiet explorations comforting, you're very welcome to like and subscribe. And if you feel like it, you can share where you're listening from in the comments. It's always grounding to imagine these stories traveling softly across the world. Now let's continue. There are moments in a life when the path forward becomes unclear. When the days feel unsteady, and the nights bring worry instead of rest. Vincent van Gogh reached such a moment in the spring of 1889. He had been living in Arles, painting with intensity, creating works that poured out of him in bright yellows and deep blues. But something had shifted. His mind, which had always been restless, had become unreliable. Episodes of distress had come, then passed, then returned. He could not predict when they would arrive or how long they would last. He had choices to make. He could remain where he was, hoping the disturbances would fade on their own. He could move to another town, another landscape, and try to begin again. Or he could seek help. He could go somewhere that offered care, structure, and perhaps a measure of safety. Vincent chose the asylum. It was a deliberate choice. No one forced him. He was not taken against his will. He made the decision himself, believing that medical care might help him regain balance. He had experienced repeated episodes of mental distress, and he knew he needed something more than solitude or willpower. He needed a place where someone would watch over him, where the days would follow a routine, where he might find steadiness. The asylum was at Saint-Thierry-de-Provence, not far from Arles. It was a place for people whose minds had become troubled. Vincent arrived there voluntarily, seeking safety and stability. He did not know what would happen. He did not know if the doctors could help him. He did not know if the disturbances would ease or continue. But he believed it was worth trying. There is something brave in that choice. To acknowledge that you cannot manage alone. To walk through a gate and place yourself in the care of others. To say, I need help and I am willing to accept it. Vincent arrived with uncertainty about what the future would hold. He carried his paints, his canvases, his brushes. He hoped he would still be able to work. He hoped the episodes would become less frequent, less severe. He hoped that in time, he might leave the asylum and return to a life that felt more his own. But he could not be sure. He could only take the step and see what came next. The decision to enter the asylum was not an ending. It was not a surrender. It was an act of agency. Vincent was choosing care over chaos. He was choosing the possibility of recovery over the certainty of continued struggle. He was making a choice that said, "My life is worth protecting, even if I do not yet know how to protect it myself." There is a quiet dignity in that. In recognizing your limits. In asking for what you need. In believing that safety matters even when the world feels unstable. Vincent walked through the gates of the asylum at Saint-Arrêt copyright my. He entered a place that was unfamiliar, uncertain, perhaps even frightening. But it was also a place where he hoped to find what he had been searching for, a measure of peace, a chance to rest, and the possibility that his mind might settle enough for him to paint again. He did not know what lay ahead. None of us do. But he took the step. He made the choice. And in doing so, he moved forward, carrying with him the belief that somewhere, somehow, there might be safety. Inside the asylum at Saint-Arrêt copyright my, life moved according to a schedule. There were hours for waking, hours for meals, hours for rest. The days followed a pattern that did not change. For Vincent, who had often lived in uncertainty, this structure was both confining and steadying. He could not come and go as he pleased. He could not wander the countryside whenever the light looked right. But he knew what each day would bring, and there was a strange comfort in that. He was allowed to paint under supervision. This permission mattered more than almost anything else. Painting was not just what Vincent did. It was how he understood the world. It was how he made sense of what he felt. Without it, the days would have been unbearable. With it, he had a purpose. He had something to reach toward. Painting became part of his daily routine. It was woven into the structure of the asylum. He would wake, eat, and then, when the light was good and his mind was clear enough, he would paint. Sometimes he worked for hours. Sometimes only briefly. But the act itself became a constant, something he could return to, something that remained his own. The asylum had gardens. It had corridors with tall windows. It had views that looked out over fields and trees and the distant hills of Provence. Vincent painted these things. He painted what was around him, what he could see from where he stood. His surroundings were limited but familiar. He walked the same paths. He looked at the same walls. He'd observed the same trees as the seasons shifted. There was a garden with irises, with roses, with tall grasses that bent in the wind. He painted them again and again. The flowers changed as the months passed, but the garden remained. It became a subject he returned to, a place he could study without leaving the grounds. He painted the corridors inside the asylum. Long hallways with arched ceilings and stone floors. The light that came through the windows made patterns on the walls. He captured that light, the way it softened in the afternoon, the way it fell across empty spaces. These were not dramatic scenes. They were quiet. They were the places where he lived. He painted views from the windows. Fields that stretched out beyond the walls. Olive groves with their twisted trunks and silver leaves. Mountains in the distance, blue and hazy. He could not walk into those fields freely, but he could see them. He could paint them. And in painting them, he could touch something beyond the limits of where he was. Vincent lived within the structured schedule of the asylum. He ate when the others ate. He rested when rest was required. He moved through the days alongside other patients, men whose minds were also troubled, whose lives had also brought them here. He did not write much about them. But he was not alone. There were others nearby living their own quiet routines, finding their own ways through. Routine provided a sense of order during an unstable period. Vincent's episodes of distress had not ended. They still came, without warning, pulling him away from his work and into confusion. But between those episodes, there were days when he could paint. Days when his thoughts were clear. Days when the structure of the asylum held him steady. He continued to work steadily when he was able. He did not know how long each period of clarity would last, so he used it fully. He painted with focus, with intention, with the knowledge that the work might be interrupted at any time. He painted as though the act itself could anchor him. There is something to be said for routine when life feels uncertain. For knowing that the day will unfold in a particular way. For having small, repeated tasks that give shape to the hours. Vincent had always been restless, always moving from place to place, always searching for something just beyond reach. But here, within the walls of the asylum, movement was not possible in the same way. So he found another kind of movement. The movement of the brush. The progression from one canvas to the next. The slow accumulation of images. He painted the gardens in spring when the flowers were bright and full. He painted them in summer when the heat pressed down and the colors deepened. He painted them as the seasons turned, as the light changed, as the plants grew and then withered. The garden became a kind of clock, marking time not in hours, but in blooms and leaves and the shifting of shadows. The corridors, too, became familiar. He knew which window caught the morning light. He knew where the stone was cool to the touch. He knew the sound of footsteps echoing, the quiet that settled in the afternoons. These were not places he would have chosen. But they became his. He painted them until they belonged to him in a way that mattered. Vincent's surroundings were limited but familiar. He could not roam freely. He could not chase the light across open fields or follow a road to see where it led. But within the boundaries he was given, he found depth. He found variation. He found enough to sustain his work. There is a kind of strength in that. In making use of what is available. In not waiting for perfect circumstances. In painting what is in front of you because it is there and because the act of painting is what matters. Vincent did not have freedom, but he had his hands, his eyes, his brushes. He had color and canvas. He had the ability to observe and respond. And so he painted. Day after day, when he was able. He painted the asylum garden. He painted the view from his window. He painted the corridors where he walked. He painted the fields beyond the walls. He painted the life that was unfolding around him, quietly, steadily within the confines of a place meant for healing. The routine did not cure him. It did not take away the distress or the uncertainty. But it gave him something to hold on to. A rhythm. A structure. A way to move through each day with purpose. And in that routine, he found space to work. To create. To continue being the person he had chosen to be, even in a place where so much felt out of his control. Vincent painted under supervision. He painted within the schedule of the asylum. He painted what he could see from where he stood. And in doing so, he transformed limitation into work. He transformed confinement into art. He took the small, repeated moments of each day and made them into something that would last. Vincent's mental health continued to fluctuate while at Saint-Arrêt till the copyright Mai. The episodes he had hoped would ease did not disappear. They came and went, unpredictable as weather. Some days his mind was clear. He could think, plan, observe. He could hold a brush steadily and make decisions about color and form. Other days, clarity slipped away. His thoughts became confused. The world around him lost its shape. He could not work. He could only wait for the disturbance to pass. Periods of clarity alternated with periods of distress. There was no pattern he could rely on. No way to know how long each phase would last. A stretch of good days might extend into a week, 2 weeks, even longer. Then, without warning, the distress would return. It pulled him away from his easel, away from the gardens, away from the work that mattered most to him. And when it lifted, he would find himself back at the beginning, trying to regain what had been interrupted. During clear periods, he returned to painting with focus. He did not waste time. He did not wait to feel perfectly well. As soon as his mind steadied enough to see clearly, to think clearly, he picked up his brushes. He went back to the garden, back to the window, back to the canvas he had left unfinished. He painted as though making up for lost time. As though storing up work against the next interruption. There was urgency in this. Not the urgency of ambition or deadline, but the urgency of knowing that clarity might not last. That today he could paint, but tomorrow might be different. So he painted today. He painted with attention and care, but also with the knowledge that time was uncertain. Painting offered structure during times of uncertainty. It gave him a task, a reason to move through the day. Even when his mind felt fragile, even when he could not be sure how long he would remain steady, the act of painting provided something to hold on to. A routine within the routine of the asylum. A small corner of control in a life that often felt beyond his control. Vincent remained deeply committed to his work despite illness. The fluctuations did not weaken his resolve. If anything, they sharpened it. He knew that painting was what anchored him. It was what made the difficult days bearable. It was what gave meaning to the effort of continuing. So he continued. Not because it was easy. Not because he felt confident. But because it was what he could do, what he needed to do, what he chose to do. He experienced frustration with the unpredictability of his condition. This frustration was quiet but persistent. He wanted to work steadily. He wanted to follow a thought from beginning to end without interruption. He wanted to plan a series of paintings and complete them in order. But his mind would not allow that. It imposed its own rhythm, its own interruptions. He had to learn to work within those limits, even when they felt unbearable. There were days when he felt angry at his own body, his own mind. Days when the inability to predict what tomorrow would bring felt like a kind of imprisonment worse than the asylum walls. He had come here seeking stability, and yet stability remained out of reach. The structure of the asylum could hold his days in place, but it could not hold his thoughts. It could not prevent the episodes from returning. Progress was uneven and uncertain. He could not measure improvement in a straight line. Some weeks he painted prolifically. Other weeks he could barely lift a brush. Some canvases came together quickly, confidently. Others stalled halfway through and sat unfinished while he waited for clarity to return. He could not predict which days would be productive and which would be lost. And yet he kept going. That is what persistence looks like when circumstances are unstable. Not steady forward motion, but the willingness to return after each interruption. To start again after each setback. To pick up the brush even when you are not sure how long you will be able to hold it. Vincent painted through the fluctuation. He did not wait for perfect health. He did not postpone his work until he felt fully well. He painted in the spaces between distress. He painted when he could, as much as he could, for as long as he could. And when the distress returned and painting became impossible, he waited. He rested. He endured. And when clarity came back, he returned to the garden, to the window, to the canvas. There is a kind of courage in that. Not the courage of a single bold action, but the courage of repeated small choices. The choice to try again. The choice to believe that the work matters, even when progress is slow and uncertain. The choice to trust that the clear days will return, even when you are in the middle of a dark one. Painting offered him more than structure. It offered him identity. It reminded him of who he was beneath the illness. He was not just a patient. He was not just someone whose mind was troubled. He was an artist. He was someone who saw the world with particular eyes and tried to capture it on canvas. That did not change, even when everything else felt unstable. The fluctuations were exhausting. They drained him physically and emotionally. He wanted so much to be reliable to himself and to his work. He wanted to know that when he began a painting, he would be able to finish it. He wanted to trust his own mind. But trust was difficult when the ground kept shifting beneath him. Still, he found ways to adapt. He learned to work quickly during the clear periods, knowing they might be brief. He learned not to plan too far ahead, because plans required a stability he did not have. He learned to take each day as it came, to measure success not by what he had hoped to accomplish, but by what he had actually been able to do. And what he was able to do, even under these conditions, was remarkable. He painted gardens in full bloom. He painted olive groves with their ancient, twisting trunks. He painted the view from his window, the fields stretching out toward distant mountains. He painted the asylum itself, its corridors and courtyards. He painted wheat fields under turbulent skies. He painted stars that swirled and glowed. Each painting was an act of persistence. Each one was proof that he had returned, that he had found his way back to the work. Each canvas was a small victory over the uncertainty that threatened to overwhelm him. Vincent's commitment to his work was not blind optimism. He did not pretend that everything was fine. He did not minimize the difficulty of his situation. But he believed that painting mattered. He believed that creating something, anything, was better than surrendering to the chaos. And so he painted. Not because it was easy. Not because it solved everything. But because it was what he could offer. It was what he could contribute, even from within the walls of an asylum, even with a mind that would not stay steady. The frustration did not leave him. The unpredictability did not stop being painful. But alongside the frustration, there was also determination. Alongside the uncertainty, there was also work. He could not control his condition. He could not will himself into stability. But he could control whether he picked up the brush when clarity returned. And he did. Again and again, he did. That is what it means to persist amid instability. To keep showing up, even when the circumstances are difficult. To keep working, even when progress is uneven. To keep believing that the work has value, even when the world feels uncertain. Vincent painted through the fluctuation. He painted between episodes. He painted in the spaces where his mind allowed. He painted with frustration and with focus. He painted because it was the one thing he could still do, the one thing that remained his own. And in doing so, he created work that would endure long after the fluctuations had ended. Vincent eventually left the asylum at Saint-Terre till the copyright my. After months of living within its walls, of painting its gardens and corridors, of following its routines, he walked back through the gates. He did not leave because he was cured. He did not leave because all uncertainty had passed. But there came a point when staying no longer felt necessary. A point when the possibility of life beyond the asylum began to seem worth attempting. The decision came after periods of relative stability. There had been stretches of time when the episodes became less frequent, when his mind remained clearer for longer. These calmer periods allowed him to imagine what might come next. To wonder if he could manage outside the structure that had held him. To consider whether a different place, a different arrangement, might support him in continuing his work. Stability is a relative word. Vincent was not wholly well. The disturbances had not disappeared entirely, but they had lessened enough that leaving seemed possible. That staying felt more confining than helpful. That the walls which had once offered safety now felt like barriers to the life he wanted to live. He hoped a new environment might support his recovery. Saint-Terre tilde copyright my had given him routine, supervision, a place to rest when his mind would not cooperate. But it was also a place of illness, a place where everyone around him was struggling. He wondered if being somewhere else, somewhere quieter, somewhere less defined by sickness, might allow him to heal more fully. To find a kind of stability that did not require walls and schedules and supervision. This hope was fragile. He could not be certain. He had no guarantee that leaving would improve things. But hope does not require certainty. It only requires the willingness to try. And Vincent was willing. He was willing to believe that the next chapter might be different. That the work he had done to stabilize might carry him forward into something better. Leaving the asylum involved both hope and apprehension. Hope that the worst was behind him. Hope that he could live more freely, paint more freely, exist without the constant reminders of illness. But also apprehension. Worry that without the structure of the asylum, the episodes might return more forcefully. Worry that he might not be able to manage on his own. Worry that he was making the wrong choice. These two feelings existed side by side. They did not cancel each other out. Vincent could feel hopeful and worried at the same time. He could believe in the possibility of recovery while also fearing what might happen. This is the nature of transition. It holds both endings and beginnings, both relief and uncertainty. He packed his belongings. His paints, his brushes, his canvases. The tools that had sustained him through the difficult months. He gathered the paintings he had completed, the work that had come out of this place. They would travel with him, evidence of what he had endured and what he had created despite the difficulty. Vincent remained aware of his ongoing vulnerability. He knew he was not invulnerable. He knew his mind could still falter. The time at Saint-Terre tilde copyright my had taught him that stability was not permanent. That clarity could slip away without warning. That the work of maintaining balance was continuous, not something achieved once and then set aside. This awareness was not defeat. It was realism. It was understanding his own limits without letting those limits define everything. He could be vulnerable and still move forward. He could acknowledge fragility and still choose to leave. Awareness of weakness does not require surrender. Sometimes it simply means moving carefully, thoughtfully, with eyes open. The future felt open but uncertain. He did not know what would happen next. He did not have a detailed plan. He knew where he would go, but not what life would look like there. Whether he would be able to paint as he had at Saint-Terre till the copyright my. Whether the episodes would continue or fade. Whether leaving was the right decision or a mistake he would come to regret. But uncertainty is not the same as impossibility. An open future means there is still room for things to unfold. Still potential for change, for growth, for unexpected grace. Vincent walked toward that openness, carrying both hope and apprehension, aware of his vulnerability, unsure of what lay ahead. There's something tender about this moment of leaving. About closing a door on a place that held you when you needed holding, even if it was not a place you wanted to stay. The asylum had been difficult. It had been confining. But it had also been shelter. It had given him time to paint, time to stabilize, time to gather strength for whatever came next. He did not leave with triumph. He left quietly, the way most transitions happen. One foot in front of the other. One decision leading to the next. The gates behind him, the road ahead. The past months folded into memory, the future unwritten. Vincent had spent so much of his life moving from place to place, always searching for the right conditions, the right light, the right circumstances in which to work. Leaving Saint-Terre till the copyright my was another kind of movement. Not toward something he had clearly identified, but away from a structure that no longer fit. Toward possibility, even if that possibility was vague. He carried with him the knowledge that he could survive difficulty. That he could paint through fluctuation. That routine and structure could hold him when his mind could not hold itself. These were not small things to know. They were tools, just as real as the brushes in his bag. The apprehension he felt was natural. Leaving safety is always a risk, even when safety has become too small. There is comfort in knowing what each day will bring, even if those days are hard. Stepping into the unknown requires a different kind of courage. Not the courage to endure, but the courage to change. To trust that movement is possible, that life can shift, that new conditions might allow for new ways of being. Vincent hoped. That is what leaving required most of all. Not certainty, but hope. The belief that the decision to leave could lead somewhere worth going. That a new environment might offer what Saint-Terre till the copyright might could no longer provide. That stability might be found outside the walls as well as within them. He hoped, and he worried, and he walked forward anyway. Because staying was no longer an option that served him. Because the work he wanted to do, the life he wanted to live, required more freedom than the asylum allowed. Because sometimes you have to leave even when you were not completely ready, trusting that readiness will come with the act of moving. The future felt open. That openness held both promise and risk. It held the possibility of continued healing and the possibility of renewed struggle. It held new landscapes to paint and new challenges to face. Vincent did not know which would predominate. He only knew that staying still was not the answer. So he left. He walked away from the gardens he had painted so many times. Away from the window with its view of distant fields. Away from the corridors where light fell in familiar patterns. He left behind the structure that had held him, carrying with him what he had learned, what he had painted, what he had endured. He left Saint-Terre till the copyright my aware of his vulnerability, hopeful about the future, apprehensive about what might come, but willing to find out. willing to step into uncertainty because staying in safety had become its own kind of cage. Willing to trust that somewhere ahead, there might be a place where he could live and work with a little more freedom, a little more ease. The road stretched ahead of him. The future was open. And Vincent, fragile and hopeful, uncertain and determined, walked toward it. Vincent moved to Auvers-sur-Oise after leaving Saint-Artilde copyright Mai. It was a small village north of Paris, surrounded by fields and quiet lanes. The kind of place where life moves slowly, where the seasons were visible in the landscape, where a painter could work without distraction. He arrived in May, when the countryside was green and bright, when the days were long and the light was soft. He lived under the care and supervision of a physician. This arrangement had been made before he arrived. The physician was someone who understood artists, who had painted himself, who believed that creative work could be part of healing. Vincent was not entirely on his own. There was someone watching over him, someone he could turn to if the distress returned. This was not the same as the asylum. There were no walls, no schedules. But there was support. A quiet presence in the background, should he need it. Auvers offered open countryside and quiet surroundings. After the months at Saint-Artilde copyright Mai, after the structured days and supervised painting, this openness felt like release. Vincent could walk where he wanted. He could set up his easel in a field without asking permission. He could paint for as long as the light lasted, with no bells calling him back to a corridor or a garden enclosed by walls. The village itself was small and unassuming. Thatched cottages, narrow streets, a church with a simple spire. Fields stretched out in every direction, divided by hedgerows and paths. There were gardens, wheat fields beginning to ripen, clusters of wildflowers along the roadsides. It was the kind of landscape Vincent had always been drawn to. Humble, honest, full of quiet life. Vincent painted extensively during this period. He worked with an intensity that surprised even him. Canvas after canvas, sometimes more than one in a day. He painted the fields around Auvers. He painted the village streets. He painted the church, the town hall, the houses with their red roofs and green shutters. He painted gardens bursting with color. He painted the wheat fields as they turned from green to gold. His work focused on landscapes and village scenes. He was interested in the ordinary, the places people lived and worked, the fields they harvested, the streets they walked. He painted these subjects with care, with attention to light and structure and the particular character of each place. He was not looking for drama. He was looking for truth, for the quiet beauty of everyday life. The productivity was remarkable. In just a few months, he created dozens of paintings. It was as though all the restlessness, all the accumulated energy from the months at the asylum, was pouring out onto canvas. He painted quickly but not carelessly. Each work was deliberate. Each one carried the weight of observation and choice. But productivity alone does not tell the whole story. Vincent continued to struggle emotionally despite the work. Painting did not solve everything. It gave him purpose, structure, a reason to wake each morning and step outside. But it did not erase the fatigue he felt. It did not quiet all the doubts. It did not lift the weight that pressed on him, even on days when the light was beautiful and the work went well. His correspondence reflected concern, fatigue, and uncertainty. In letters to his brother, to friends, he wrote about the work he was doing. But he also wrote about worry, about the burden he felt he placed on others, about the cost of materials, of living, of continuing to paint when so little sold, about the future which remained unclear, about whether what he was doing mattered, whether it would ever be seen, whether he could sustain it. There was a tiredness in these letters. Not just physical exhaustion, though that was present too, but a deeper weariness. The kind that comes from carrying uncertainty for too long, from hoping and not seeing hope realized, from working and still feeling that something essential remained out of reach. He experienced both hope and exhaustion in these months. They lived alongside each other, inseparable. He could paint a field of wheat and feel, for a moment, that everything made sense. That the work was good. That the effort was worthwhile. And then, later the same day, he could sit with his paints and feel the weight of it all. The years of struggle. The instability. The sense that he was asking too much of himself and of those who supported him. Hope and exhaustion are not opposites. They can coexist. You can believe in what you are doing and still feel worn down by the effort it requires. You can create something beautiful and still wonder if it is enough. Vincent lived in that tension. He painted with hope. He rested with exhaustion. He woke each morning and chose to continue, even when continuing felt impossibly hard. Overs was supposed to be a place of healing. A quiet village where he could paint without the pressure of the asylum, without the weight of structure and supervision. And in some ways, it was. He had freedom there. He had countryside and light and subjects that moved him. But freedom did not erase the struggle. Quiet surroundings did not silence the doubts. He painted the wheat fields under wide skies. He painted them in sunlight and under clouds. He painted them as the grain ripened and the stalks bent in the wind. These fields were ancient subjects. Farmers had worked them for centuries. They represented labor, sustenance, the cycle of growth and harvest. Vincent saw all of that. He painted it with reverence. But the fields also carried something heavier. They stretched out endlessly, flat and open, under skies that sometimes felt too vast. There was beauty in them, but also a kind of loneliness. A sense of smallness beneath the wide expanse of sky. Vincent captured that too. The beauty and the weight, held together in paint. The village scenes were gentler. Houses with gardens. Narrow streets where people walked. The church rising above the rooftops. These were places of human presence, human connection. Vincent painted them with warmth, with an attention that suggested care. But even in these scenes, there is a quietness. A sense of distance. As though he was observing life from slightly outside it, painting what he saw, but not quite inhabiting it himself. His correspondence during these months reveals a mind that would not rest. He wrote about technique, about color, about the paintings he was working on. But he also wrote about money, about Theo's family, about the burden of needing support when he could not support himself. He felt this burden deeply. It was not something he could set aside or ignore. It colored everything, even the good days. He was tired. Not just from the work, though the pace of painting was exhausting. But tired in a deeper way. Tired of instability. Tired of uncertainty. Tired of fighting for clarity, for balance, for the ability to keep working. He had been fighting for a long time. and fighting, even when you believe in what you are fighting for, takes a toll. And yet he kept painting. That is the remarkable thing. Despite the exhaustion, despite the doubts, despite the weight he carried, he painted. He painted the fields and the village. He painted gardens and streets and rooftops. He painted light falling across ordinary places. He painted as though the act itself was necessary, as though stopping was not an option he could consider. Vincent experienced hope in overs. He hoped that this new environment would help. He hoped that the physician's care would stabilize him. He hoped that the quiet countryside would offer something the asylum could not. He hoped that the work he was doing mattered, that it would endure, that someday it might be seen and valued. But alongside that hope, there was exhaustion. A tiredness that did not lift, even on good days. A sense that the struggle was ongoing, perhaps endless. That stability, true stability, remained just out of reach. That the work, as much as it sustained him, also demanded more than he sometimes felt he had to give. He painted through it all. Through hope and exhaustion. Through doubt and determination. Through beautiful days and heavy ones. He painted because it was what he knew how to do. Because it was what gave shape to his days. Because even when everything else felt uncertain, the act of putting paint on canvas was something solid, something real, something he could hold on to. The final months at Overs were productive. They were also hard. Both things are true. Vincent created work that would last, that would be remembered, that would speak to people long after he was gone. And he did it while carrying weight that most of us cannot fully imagine. He did it while tired, while uncertain, while struggling to believe that any of it would matter. But he painted anyway. He painted the fields and the sky. He painted the village and its people. He painted light and color and the quiet, enduring presence of the world around him. And in doing so, he left behind something that could not be erased. Something that outlasted the exhaustion. Something that turned struggle into beauty, weight into work, uncertainty into art. Vincent died in 1990 at the age of 37. It happened in July, in the middle of summer, when the wheat fields around Overs were at their fullest. The days were long and warm. The light was golden. He had been painting right up until the end, working in those fields, capturing the landscape he had come to know so well. And then, quietly, his life came to a close. His death occurred in Overs-sur-Oise, the small village where he had spent his final months. Where he had painted so many canvases. Where he had walked the streets and fields, easel on his back, searching for subjects. The place that was supposed to offer healing became the place where his life ended. There was no warning that could have prepared those around him. No clear sign that this was coming. Life simply stopped. He was buried in the village cemetery. A modest plot on a hillside, overlooking fields. The kind of place where the land rolls gently, where wildflowers grow between the graves, where the view stretches out toward the horizon. It was a quiet spot. Peaceful in its simplicity. The sort of place Vincent might have painted had he seen it from a different angle, in a different season. His brother Theo attended the burial. Theo, who had supported him for so many years. Who had sent money and materials. Who had read his letters and encouraged his work. Who had believed in him when almost no one else did. Theo stood there among the small gathering, beside the grave, watching as his brother was laid to rest. The loss must have been unbearable. Not just the loss of a brother, but the loss of someone whose life had been so entwined with his own. The funeral was small and modest. There was no grand ceremony. No crowds of mourners. Just a handful of people who had known Vincent in those final months. The physician who had cared for him. A few neighbors from the village. A small group gathered to mark the end of a life that had been, by most measures, difficult and overlooked. The service was simple. A few words, a burial, and then the quiet afterward. Vincent sold very few paintings during his lifetime. This is one of the painful truths. He worked constantly, passionately, creating hundreds of paintings and drawings. He poured everything into his art. But the world did not respond. Galleries did not clamor for his work. Collectors did not line up to buy. He lived on his brother's support, always aware that he was not earning his way, always carrying the weight of that dependence. There were a few sales. A painting here or there. Exchanges with other artists. Small transactions that barely registered. But nothing that suggested his work was valued in the way he hoped it would be. Nothing that gave him financial security or public recognition. He painted in obscurity, known only to a small circle of friends and family, unseen by the wider world that would later claim him as a master. Recognition of his work came only after his death. In the years that followed, slowly, quietly, people began to notice. Other artists saw what he had done. Critics began to write about him. Exhibitions were organized. His paintings, which had gathered dust in storage, began to appear in galleries. The work that had been ignored in his lifetime started to find an audience. But by then Vincent was gone. He was not there to see it happen. This is one of the cruelest ironies. That the recognition he longed for, the validation that might have eased his burden, came too late. He spent his life creating, hoping, believing that the work mattered. But he never received confirmation. He never saw a museum filled with his paintings. He never heard strangers moved to tears by his sunflowers or his starry skies. He died not knowing. Vincent never lived to know the impact of his art. He did not know that his paintings would hang in museums around the world. That people would travel great distances to stand in front of them. That his name would become synonymous with passion and creativity and the struggle of the artist. He did not know that his letters would be published, read, studied. That his life would be examined, analyzed, turned into books and films and endless conversations. All of that came later. After the small funeral. After the modest burial. After Theo walked away from the grave and returned to a world that suddenly felt emptier. Vincent died in obscurity, unaware of the legacy he was leaving behind. He died believing, perhaps, that his work might matter someday. But not knowing. Not certain. Carrying that uncertainty to the very end. There is something profoundly sad about this. To work so hard, to care so deeply, and to die without knowing whether any of it mattered. To pour your life into something and never receive confirmation that it was worthwhile. Vincent painted for the sake of painting. Because he had to. Because it was who he was. But he was also human. He wanted to know that it meant something. And that knowledge never came. The quiet after his death was not immediate recognition. It was silence at first. The world continued as it had. People and overs went about their lives. The fields were harvested. The seasons changed. Vincent's paintings sat in storage, unseen, waiting. It would take time for the shift to happen, for people to look at his work and understand what they were seeing, for the recognition to build slowly until it became impossible to ignore. But in those first days and weeks after his death, there was just absence. Theo grieving. A grave on a hillside. A collection of paintings that most people had never seen. A life that had ended too soon, too quietly, without fanfare or acknowledgement. Just the fact of death and the space left behind. Vincent's life was defined by struggle, by instability and poverty and mental anguish, by the constant effort to create despite everything working against him. He did not have an easy life. He did not have a life that looked, from the outside, like success. But he had his work. He had the paintings he made in dark rooms and bright fields. He had the commitment to keep going, to keep painting, even when there was no clear reason to believe it would lead anywhere. And in the end, that work outlasted everything else. The struggle, the poverty, the illness, the obscurity. All of it faded into history. But the paintings remained. They endured. They became the thing that defined him, not the difficulty of his life, but the beauty he created in spite of it. Vincent was buried in a modest grave in Overs. The earth covered him. The grass grew over the spot. Seasons passed. And slowly, so slowly, the world began to turn its attention to what he had left behind. Not because of anything that happened after his death, but because of what he had done during his life. The work he had made. The vision he had pursued. The art that he had believed in, even when no one else did. He never knew. That is the sorrow at the heart of his story. He never knew that his belief was justified. That his work would matter. That people would look at his paintings and see something true, something beautiful, something that spoke to the deepest parts of being human. He died in uncertainty, and only afterward did certainty arrive. Too late for him, but not too late for his art. The small funeral. The modest grave. The few people gathered on a summer day to say goodbye. This was how Vincent's life ended. Not with celebration or recognition. Not with the knowledge that his struggle had been worth it. Just with the quiet finality of death, and the hope, perhaps, that somewhere, somehow, the work he had done would find its way into the world. It did. But he was not there to see it. He left behind paintings and letters. He left behind a record of a life lived with intensity and purpose. He left behind evidence that even in the hardest circumstances, even when recognition seems impossible, it is still worth creating. Still worth believing. Still worth putting color on canvas and trusting that it means something, even if you never know for certain. Vincent died at 37. He was buried in Overs. Theo stood beside his grave. A small group marked his passing. And then the quiet settled in. The quiet that held his work, waiting for the world to catch up. Waiting for people to see what he had seen. Waiting for the recognition that would come, eventually, long after it could reach him. He painted because he had to. Because it was the only way he knew to make sense of the world. Because color and light and form mattered to him in a way that nothing else did. And in painting, he left something that could not be taken away. Something that would last. Something that would speak for him, long after he could no longer speak for himself. The story ends here, in a cemetery in Overs. With a life finished. with work left behind, with a world not yet knowing what it had lost or what it had gained. The quiet after death is not an ending. It is a threshold. And on the other side of it, Vincent's paintings waited, patient and enduring, for the recognition that would eventually come. As Vincent's life came to an end, there was no sudden recognition, no sense of arrival, only quiet. He did not know what his work would become. He did not know how widely his paintings would travel, or how deeply they would one day be felt. What he knew was the daily act of working, of observing, of returning, of painting what he could from where he stood. In that way, his life does not close with an answer, but with a pause. The world would come later. The meaning would unfold slowly. And the work would wait. Thank you for spending this time with the story, whether you listen closely or simply let it drift alongside you. These quiet moments are meant to be lived with gently, not held tightly. If you found comfort in this series, you're very welcome to like and subscribe, and to continue with future quiet explorations here at Calm Art Studio. And if you feel like it, you can share where you're listening from. It's always grounding to know how far these calm stories travel. For now, you don't need to carry anything forward. The story can rest here. Thank you for listening.